Racist cop mocks black waitress in courtroom, freezes when she declares the verdict. Camden City Courthouse sat cold and indifferent beneath the gray winter sky, its towering structure looming over the city as if to remind everyone of its unyielding presence. The wind cut through the narrow streets, sending echoes of a chilling hum through the empty alleyways. Inside the courthouse, the air felt heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken judgments and unresolved stories. Marble floors gleamed in the dim light, and the scent of old paper, coffee, and lingering tension filled the halls. The courthouse was an intimidating place for many, a place where people's fates were decided with a gavel's swing, where lives were altered with a single sentence. But for Zariah Williams, this place, this building, had become her second home. She walked through the halls with practiced ease, a tray of coffee cups, creamers, and sugar packets balancing in her hands. Her footsteps were soft, but purposeful. Her head was slightly bowed, her eyes focused ahead, as though she were invisible to the world around her. To most, she was just another figure in the background, another black woman in a service uniform. Her presence went unnoticed, unimportant in the grand narrative of the courthouse. Her name was Zariah Williams, but there was more to Zariah than what met the eye. She wasn't just a server. She wasn't just an invisible figure in the courthouse. She was a law student, a legal researcher, a woman who had fought tooth and nail to be here. Her role, though seemingly insignificant to those who passed her by, was a small yet deliberate step in her bigger journey. She had worked tirelessly for her place here, and this was merely the beginning. She had grown up watching her mother clean offices and scrub floors in the homes of people who rarely bothered to acknowledge her humanity. Her mother had taught her resilience, had shown her that dignity wasn't given, it was earned. Zariah had sworn to herself that one day she would rise beyond the limitations society tried to place on her. As she walked past the rows of seats in the hallway, Zariah barely took notice of the small group of police officers gathered by the courtroom doors, chatting among themselves in low tones. They were standing in casual groups, cups of coffee in hand, exchanging quiet laughter over some private joke. Then one of them, a man with graying hair and a broad, imposing frame, caught sight of Zariah. He stopped mid-laugh and locked eyes with her, his gaze cold, dismissive, almost condescending. He was Officer Rick Dunham. He was no stranger to power and privilege, and the sight of a black woman serving coffee seemed to provoke something in him, a sense of superiority that was as old as the courthouse itself. He turned to his colleagues, his voice a low growl, but loud enough for Zariah to hear. "She should know her place," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "This is a courthouse, not a fast food joint." The words were a slap, sharp and unexpected, and they stung. But Zariah didn't flinch. She didn't react. Not outwardly. She simply paused for a moment, her gaze lifting slightly to meet his, her face as still and composed as ever. Her heart, however, beat a little faster. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. With a quiet nod, Zariah continued on her path, her steps unbroken. She walked past the officers as though nothing had happened, her face a mask of calm. In truth, the words had pierced her, just as they had so many times before. But she had learned long ago that reacting, giving them the satisfaction of seeing her anger, would only diminish her. In her mind, memories rushed to the surface. She thought of her mother, her gentle, strong mother, who had spent her life cleaning other people's messes, wiping away their mistakes, all while her own dignity was trampled beneath the weight of prejudice. Zariah could still see the look on her mother's face the day she was fired from a job for something as trivial as spilling a glass of water. The woman she worked for had ordered her out with a cruel, dismissive wave, muttering something about how people like you just didn't know how to take care of things. Zariah remembered her mother's shoulders slumped, her eyes red with humiliation. That day, Zariah had promised herself that she would never let anyone treat her like that. She would rise above it. She would become someone whose worth was never questioned. Someone who stood in places where people like Officer Dunham could never even dream of being. She was here in the courthouse not as a mere servant, not as someone meant to be ignored. She was here to learn, to become something more. But she was also here to remind herself of who she was, and who she could one day be. Zariah passed the officers without another glance, but something inside her stirred. A fire that had been simmering quietly for years began to burn brighter. The sting of their words, the dismissive looks, they only fueled her resolve. She was already standing taller than they realized. She didn't need to prove herself to them. She just needed to keep moving forward. She placed the coffee tray on the table in the break room, her movements efficient and deliberate. But even as she stood there, silently watching others go about their business, her mind was elsewhere. The people in the courthouse didn't know her. They didn't know the late nights spent studying by the flickering streetlight outside her apartment, the countless hours spent researching case law, the sacrifices she had made to get here. She was more than a face in the crowd. She was more than a server bringing coffee. She was going to be a part of this world, and nothing was going to stop her. As the clock ticked on and the courthouse bustled with activity, Zariah stood at the back of the room, silently observing. Her eyes flicked over the courtroom, noting the movements of the attorneys, the subtle shifts in posture that revealed more than any spoken word could. She was waiting for the moment when her place in this world, the place she had earned, would be revealed. For now, she remained invisible, a quiet observer in a world full of noise. But the day would come when she would no longer be overlooked. The day would come when she would stand at the front, and people would finally see her for what she was, what she had always been. And when that day came, she would be ready. The courtroom had fallen into a rhythm, a quiet hum of voices, shuffling papers, and the occasional clink of a coffee cup. Officer Rick Dunham, sitting at the defense table, was all too familiar with this environment. It was a place he knew well, a place where power and influence often dictated the outcome of cases. But today there was something different in the air, something Zariah could feel as she stood at the back of the room, quietly observing, just as she always did. Rick was the defendant in the case, accused of using excessive force against a black teenager during an arrest. The evidence was damning, but Rick wasn't worried. His confidence, if anything, was unshakable. He had been in enough situations like this to know that the law was rarely ever about what was right or wrong. It was about who had the most power. And Rick had power. He had rank. He had a badge. And most importantly, he had a belief that the law always stood by those who held those things. "I told you, the law always stands by people like me," Rick had once said to his fellow officers during an offhand conversation. It was a casual statement, but it carried a weight that reflected his mindset. The system was there to protect him. And if that wasn't enough, his history as a respected officer would surely guarantee his safety. Zariah, sitting silently behind him, couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling in her gut. She had heard the whispers. She had seen the subtle glances from the officers who thought her presence meant nothing. But Zariah was more than just a server. She had been chosen by Judge Parker to serve as a reserve judge, an appointment that no one but the judge himself knew about. Zariah wasn't just waiting to serve coffee. She was waiting for the right moment, the moment when everything would change. The morning dragged on, the trial continuing with a back and forth between the defense and prosecution. But as the day wore on, Zariah found herself distracted by something deeper than the case itself. She could feel the tension in the air, the way it hung over the room like a dark cloud, pressing down on everyone. Officer Dunham's arrogance was palpable. His constant smirk as he looked down at the defense table only made the situation worse. Zariah focused on the proceedings, though. She had work to do. There were coffee refills to make, more cups to serve. The jurors, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, now seemed restless. It was time for a break, time to stretch their legs, and Zariah knew she had a job to do. With a quiet nod, she stood and moved to the back of the room. She moved swiftly and efficiently, balancing the tray of coffee cups, her hands steady as ever. She was used to this, used to being in the background, used to remaining invisible to the rest of the world. But today felt different. Today, Zariah could sense the eyes that followed her every step, the way the officers looked at her with something less than respect. As she walked past Officer Rick Dunham, he caught her gaze and smiled in that smug, dismissive way that Zariah had come to expect from him. He was standing near the jurors, chatting with a few of the officers, when he turned toward her. "Do you know anything about the law?" Rick sneered. "You're always scribbling down notes and taking coffee orders. Maybe you should stick to washing the cups." There was a small laugh from the group of officers nearby, a few chuckles from the others in the room. The sound was light, almost mocking, and it stung Zariah more than she cared to admit. She didn't flinch, though. She simply kept her gaze on him for a moment, not with anger, but with something far more powerful, calm indifference. She didn't need to answer him. She didn't need to dignify his words with a response. But Sandra, an older juror who had been silently watching Zariah from the beginning, didn't find the moment amusing. Sandra's eyes locked onto Zariah, and though she didn't speak, her expression said everything. There was no amusement in her face, only a deep, quiet recognition. Zariah felt the weight of it, a recognition that came from experience, from years of witnessing the unspoken truths of the world. And then, just as the weight of that moment began to settle, something unexpected happened. Judge Parker, the presiding judge over the case, suddenly appeared pale. His hand gripped the side of the bench, and for a moment, the courtroom went silent. A murmur of confusion rippled through the room as he placed his hand to his forehead, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. Zariah watched, her heart skipping a beat, as the judge swayed slightly in his seat. Something was wrong. I'm sorry, but I must step away for a moment," Judge Parker said, his voice strained. There was no further explanation, but it was clear that something was happening that he could no longer control. Without another word, the judge stood up shakily, and as he did, he addressed the courtroom. "According to the court's rules, the trial will continue under the authority of a reserve judge." Judge Parker's voice echoed in the now quiet room. "I'm stepping down temporarily, and the proceedings will be continued under Judge Zariah Williams." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Zariah's name hung in the air for a moment, and then the entire courtroom seemed to freeze. It wasn't just the shock of the announcement, it was the sheer absurdity of it. No one had expected it. No one had seen it coming. Rick Dunham's face contorted in disbelief as his eyes fixed on Zariah. His jaw dropped, and for a split second, he looked like a man who had seen the ground beneath him crumble away. Zariah stood there, her expression serene, her back straight. She did not look at Rick, nor did she acknowledge the murmurs that began to swell in the room. Her hands were steady as she placed the coffee tray on a nearby table. With the same quiet dignity, she unbuttoned her service uniform and removed it. Slowly, almost deliberately, she donned the black robe of a judge. It felt different, heavier than she had imagined, but it was a weight she had prepared herself for. The robe symbolized years of work, of struggle, of silence. And now it symbolized her moment. As Zariah walked to the bench, There was no rush, no frantic energy. She moved with purpose, with a grace that commanded attention without ever demanding it. Each step she took toward the judge's seat seemed to echo louder than the last. When she finally reached the bench, she didn't look at the stunned faces of the courtroom. She didn't look at the confused officers or the stunned jury. She looked straight ahead, her gaze steady, unwavering. She was ready. The room was completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. Rick Dunham, his face pale and his pride shattered, was the first to speak. But the words caught in his throat. He couldn't find the words. And for the first time in his career, Rick Dunham felt the sting of real powerlessness. Zariah stood tall, her hands resting on the bench, and with a quiet but firm voice, she addressed the room. "It's time to continue the trial," she said. "We'll proceed under my guidance now." The silence remained, but the weight in the room had shifted. This wasn't just another trial. This was a turning point, and Zariah was no longer the invisible woman who served coffee. She was the one in control. She was the judge. Zariah Williams stood in front of the bench, her fingers gently gripping the gavel. She could feel the weight of it, but it was different now. It was no longer just a symbol of authority. It was a declaration of everything she had fought for, everything she had endured. The courtroom, silent with anticipation, waited for her next move. The once familiar eyes of the officers, including Rick Dunham, now seemed distant. They were no longer figures of intimidation, but mere spectators in the face of her unwavering resolve. With a firm, controlled motion, Zariah raised the gavel and brought it down with a sharp, decisive tap. The sound echoed through the courtroom, loud and final. She spoke with the kind of authority that comes not from arrogance but from experience, from years of quiet struggle, from the strength that had carried her through every obstacle life had placed before her. "The trial will continue," she said, her voice carrying through the room with a calm assurance that immediately commanded the attention of everyone present. In that moment, Zariah was no longer just the woman who served coffee, the woman who had been belittled and ignored by Officer Rick Dunham. She was not the invisible figure, the one who had been mocked for daring to belong in this world. She was a force of nature now, a symbol of resilience, a living testament to the fact that no matter where you started, no matter the limitations others placed on you, you could rise. Zariah was the embodiment of justice itself, an embodiment that was now fully realized in that courtroom. As the trial unfolded, Zariah moved through the proceedings with an effortless professionalism that stunned even the most seasoned of legal minds in the room. She responded to each argument, to each piece of evidence, with remarkable clarity and poise. There was no hesitancy in her decisions. There were no cracks in her composure. Zariah had become a beacon of what it meant to stand for truth, for justice, for the courage to defy every person who ever said she wasn't worthy. Not once did she let her emotions cloud her judgment. Not once did she let the sneers of the officers, the disdain in their eyes, or the silent mockery of the jury shake her resolve. Instead, she allowed the law to speak for itself, letting the facts, the truth, and the evidence rise to the surface. Officer Rick Dunham, once so confident in his own power, now sat there with a palpable unease. His earlier arrogance had all but disappeared. His posture, once proud and defiant, had slumped into something more fragile, something uncertain. His eyes, once filled with smug superiority, now darted nervously around the room, avoiding direct contact with Zariah. He had underestimated her. He had thought her nothing more than a figure in the background, someone easily ignored, someone who wouldn't ever pose a real threat to the system he had long believed would protect him. But now, as Zariah guided the trial to its inevitable conclusion, Rick began to realize the depth of his mistake. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours, but to Zariah, it was a waiting game she had already won. She had walked through the fires of racial prejudice, through the oppressive weight of a society that constantly told her she was less. And now, she stood here, her hands steady, her heart calm, as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. When the jury finally returned, the room grew still. Zariah met their gaze, and in that moment, she felt the gravity of the situation settle over her. She had never been one to crave attention or applause. She didn't need validation, but the sense of justice, of righting a wrong, was everything. The foreman of the jury stood, clearing his throat, as all eyes turned toward him. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Rick Dunham, guilty of excessive force and violating the rights of the victim," the foreman declared, his voice resonating with the weight of their decision. There was no celebration in the room. There were no cheers or shouts of triumph. There was only a deafening silence, the kind of silence that comes when something deep, something profound, has been set right. Zariah didn't feel a sense of vindication. She didn't need it. For her, this moment wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It wasn't about the satisfaction of winning. It was about the power of the truth finally being recognized. Rick Dunham, his face ashen, lowered his head. His shoulders slumped under the weight of the verdict, his pride completely shattered. The man who had once mocked Zariah now seemed small, insignificant, as if all his years of arrogance had been reduced to nothing in the face of her strength. Zariah stood, her posture tall and resolute. She held the verdict in her hand, the paper crinkling slightly as she lifted it. "Officer Rick Dunham," she said, her voice cutting through the room with quiet authority. "You have betrayed the oath you swore to protect and serve the citizens of this country. You have misused your position, and today, you will face the consequences." Her words hung in the air, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "Therefore, I hereby sentence you to 5 years probation, the loss of your badge, and mandatory participation in a rehabilitation program to address the abuse of power you have exhibited." Zariah continued, each word deliberate and measured. "May this be a lesson that no one is above the law, not even those who wear a badge." As the words left her mouth, Zariah felt the weight of them settle inside her. It wasn't the end of her journey. It was a beginning, a shift, a small but meaningful change in a world that so desperately needed it. With the sentencing delivered, Zariah stood, her gavel rising once more, the sound of it falling a final declaration in a long-fought battle. She didn't look back at Rick Dunham. She didn't need to. He had been a part of her past, a part of the system she had dismantled in that very moment. Without saying another word, she turned and walked out of the courtroom. Her steps were sure, her head held high. No one dared to laugh behind her anymore. No one dared to whisper. She had silenced them all, not with force, but with dignity, with the quiet power that comes from knowing who you are and what you are capable of. As Zariah stepped outside the courthouse, the cool air hit her face, and she felt a strange peace settle over her. She could hear the chatter of a small group of students standing by the steps, their laughter and voices bright against the gray of the day. One young girl, no older than 15, stepped forward, her eyes wide with awe. "Are you really a judge?" the girl asked softly, her voice full of wonder. I want to be like you one day." Zariah's heart swelled as she bent down, meeting the girl's gaze. There was so much potential in her, so much hope. Zariah smiled gently, her eyes warm with understanding. "You can be," Zariah said, her voice low and sincere. "But remember this. No one has the right to tell you that you don't deserve it, not because of who you are. You can achieve anything you set your mind to." With that, she stood tall once more, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The world was hers to shape, hers to change. And no one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could ever take that away from her. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful content like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. We dive deep into impactful stories, discussions, and much more that you won't want to miss. Make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Join the community and stay inspired with every story we share. Subscribe now and follow along on this journey.